Hello everyone, we are group 6 and today we are going to introduce input interaction and second language acquisition. And I'm the first speaker, Benjamin. And I'm going to introduce the comparison of natural and classroom language environments. Natural and classroom settings are substantially different, particularly when the classroom environment involves the formal teaching of an L2. For example, Coder writes, learners do not use their interlanguage very often in a classroom for what we may call normal or authentic communicative purposes. The greater part of interlanguage data talk in the classroom is produced as a result of formal exercise and bears the same relation to the spontaneous communicative use of language as the practicing of tennis strokes does to playing tennis. And the input and output are both concerned. Coder is referring to the output of the learner, but his comments might be equally valid where the input is concerned. The classroom environment limits opportunity for hypothesis formation and tests. The reduced input may result in limited opportunities for negotiation of meaning because the teacher is deprived of the feedback necessary to make appropriate adjustment to his or her speech. And the difference of natural and classroom communicative are also reflected in different motivational orientations. According to McNamara, it is rare that in the classroom settings either the teacher or the students has anything to say to each other that is so important they are willing to improvise at each other's meaning. And the conclusion is, classroom contain less negotiation of meaning. And there are differences between natural and classroom environments, but it is wrong to overemphasize them. Natural environments can vary enormously in the types of input they afford. Also, classrooms differ in the kind of discourse they provide. Natural and classroom environments are not opposites. They provide the same discourse types in different degrees. As Christian comments, classrooms can afford opportunities for genuine communicative exchanges, while in natural settings, learners can engage in formal study. The comparison between natural and classroom environments as sources of input for SOA will depend on the frequency of different types of interaction which occurs in each setting. And here is the table of input and interaction characteristics of different types of classroom settings. And the first type of class setting is the foreign language classroom. And what's the characteristic inside? Focus likely to be on language form rather than meaning. L2 unlikely to be used for classroom management or for genuine social purposes. And compared it with natural setting, potentially less like a natural setting, little negotiation of meaning. And next, the second language classroom, for example, like English as second language. Many interactions will still focus on form rather than meaning. L2 functions as a medium of instruction as well as goal, and hence will be used for a wider range of discourse functions than in the first one. And compared it with a natural setting, more like a natural setting, some chance for negotiation of meaning. And next, the subject classroom. For example, like learners is placed in a classroom with native speaking children. And the characteristics. The focus will be on meaning rather than form. Input unlikely to be adjusted. unless numbers of L2 learners high IRF initiate response, feedback exchanges likely to predominate and will resemble exposure in natural settings. For example, input which has not been modified, but very little negotiation of meaning. And next, the bilingual classroom, for example, like where L2 learners receive instruction through both L1 and L2. And what's the principal characteristics? Mixed focus, sometimes on form, sometimes on meaning. No need for learners to attend to L2 if the same content is taught in L1 and L2, hence no input. Adjusted input will occur if L2 used to teach different subject content. And compared it with natural setting. Potentially strong resemblance to natural setting if learners have to attend to L2. Negotiation of meaning likely. And the final one, the immersion classroom, like where a class of L2 learners are taught through medium of L2. And the characteristics. Focus will be on meaning in L2 subject lessons. Input likely to be simplified. IRF initiate response feedback exchanges may still predominate. And compared it with natural setting, strongest resemblance to natural settings, plenty of opportunities for negotiation of meaning, particularly if teaching is learner-centered.
Good morning, I'm Francis. I'll be covering the second part of page 152 to the top of page 154. What I'm going to do is to read the text and/or I'll summarize or to give further details on the given information. Now on page 152, the role of input and interaction in SLA. So far, the discussion has been focused on describing and explaining the different types of input and interaction. The key question, however, is whether SLA is significantly affected by the quality and quantity of the input and interaction, and if so, how. This section will consider the question. It will begin with an account of the different ways in which the question can be tackled. It will then consider how input and interaction affect the root of SLA, and following this, the rate of SLA. This paragraph raises the question whether SLA is significantly affected by the quality and quantity of the input and interaction. If so, how? Ways of investigating the effects of input and interaction. In order to demonstrate that input and interaction have an effect on SLA, it is necessary to establish a causal relationship between the L2 data made available to the learner and his output. A number of different approaches have been used to this. Now, there are 5 examples given as the approaches to investigate the effects of input and interaction. The first one is the analysis of selected L2 input and interaction sequences. This is the approach adopted by Hatch and Long for natural SLA and Ellis for classroom SLA. For example, Hatch examines examples in native speakers, learner discourse, and then speculates in what ways they constrain SLA. Although in this approach the relationship between input and output is not established empirically, it does offer many rich hypotheses. The example of Hatch's experiment can be found on page 138. There is also a figure 6.1 on page 139. According to Hatch, the types of discourse that learner takes part in depend on who the learner is. And when in a child-learner discourse, it usually starts with the child trying to get attention of the adult with a physical object. As for adult learners, their conversations are more likely to be rooted in displaced activity, thus has a harder time identifying the topic. In Hatch's discourse theory, one of the main points is that a native speaker adjusts their language to maintain communication with a non-native speaker, and there are patterns in the learning. But in this approach, the relationship between the input and output is theorized, so instead of empirical study. So that's one of the problems to concern. The second way to investigate is extrapolation from studies of the role of input and interaction in first language acquisition. This is Krashen's approach. He lists those features of motherese which research has suggested is felicitative, and argues that similar features in the input and interaction involving second language learners will foster SLA. This approach has the advantage of drawing on a substantial body of empirical research, but it is tenable only if the assumption is justified that the role of environment is the same in first and second language acquisition. There are strong grounds for such an assumption. Motherese adjust the grammatical input and feedback in the two-way interaction between a child and its mother. This provides for successful communication and language acquisition. The value of this type of interaction is supported in the discourse theory by Hatch. When we look at how second language acquisition takes place in a natural or classroom setting, we can see many principles of motherese. For example, the interaction, feedback, varying types, and levels of input in an atmosphere that is conducive for the language learning experiences. These are all very desirable principles for acquiring a second language. However, this approach, though established empirically, is only tenable, in other words, can only be true when the environment for SLA is the same as in the first language. It can be unlikely because there are differences from that of adult talk and interaction in SLA classrooms. The third way to investigate is correlational studies. This type of approach basically measures and analyzes the relationship between input features and output features. However, they are simply drawn from the results of the analysis, and they do not demonstrate a causal relationship. And there are some of the researchers are Hatch and Wagner, Snow, and Hofnagel. And the fourth way to investigate is experimental studies. In this approach, they need to carefully control the linguistic environment to investigate the effects of certain features. In reality, these are very unlikely to be controllable factors. So what some of the researchers did is that they would create a miniature artificial language. In other words, it would make up a language with a limited set of rules in order to test out their study. The problem with this approach is that the behaviors that is being examined can also be artificial because everything was made up at the beginning. The last way to investigate is called indirect study. It is suggested by Long that the effect of input and interaction can be investigated indirectly in 3 steps. First, you need to know that A equals linguistic or conversational adjustments, B equals comprehension, and C is acquisition. These 3 steps are: first, show that A promotes B. Second, show that B promotes C. Third, deduce, in other words, predicts that A promotes C. However, in order for this to be true, it requires demonstration proving that comprehensible input is the causative variables in the input and output relationship. Now I'm going to summarize the last paragraph on page 154. The first 2 approaches of the analysis of selected input and interaction sequences and the extrapolation from studies of the role of input and interaction in first language acquisition have been the most common approaches of all. And another important point to remember is that in SLA, there are more theories than empirical studies when it comes to the effect of input and interaction, and that is something to keep in mind when you further read this chapter. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Esther, and now I'm going to talk about page 154, the effects of input and interaction on the route of SLA, to page 157, frequency, finish. So, as you can see on page 154, it has been shown earlier that there may be a natural sequence for the development of grammatical knowledge in SLA, which is also talked about in chapter 3. On the face of it, this suggests that the input is not the major determinant of the route of SLA, which this you also know is the mentalist view for input. So, if it were a major factor, variations in the sequence of development would be expected to coincide with variations in the type of input available. Thus, it would appear at first sight that the natural sequence can be more easily explained in terms of universal innate processing mechanisms. However, an explanation based on input is still tenable. So as you can see here, that Hatch argues that the natural order is the product of the way in which conversations with learners are organized. So in other words, that how learners usually learn when they speak is usually the order, the natural order of how they learn grammatically. As we have seen, the types of discourse which L2 learners, particularly children, take part are predictable. It is possible, therefore, that the natural sequence is the result of a more or less standard input derived from these predictable changes. Both the native speaker and the learner are concerned to establish and sustain a topic. The limited linguistic resources of the learner constrain how this is achieved, which in turn regulates the input the learner receives. Thus, indirectly, the natural sequence may be a reflection of conversational competence. As Hatch puts it, one learns how to do conversations. One learns how to interact verbally. And out of this interaction, syntactic structures develop, which in this case is similar to how native speakers learn their first language. However, as Hatch admits, there is a problem with this explanation in that, although the conversational topics seem to control the input for children, they do not seem to act the same way for adults. Yet, the general route of acquisition is the same for children and adults. We mentioned here earlier that it seems to control children but not adults, because when adults learn a second language, they already know what they know and what they are capable of talking about. So in conversational topics, they can control the topics to stay in the field or in the part that they are more comfortable with, and they know more knowledge in that part. As contrast to children, that they cannot control the topic of what they want to talk about because they have way more limited knowledge. So, in the last paragraph of page 154, if Hatch is right, the order of acquisition is a reflection of conversation growth. It still remains to be shown in precisely that way. So, later on, we will be talking about the 5 effects of input and interaction of the route of SLA. Firstly, is formulaic speech. So as you can see here on page 155, one way in which interaction can aid SLA is by providing the learner with ready-made chunks of speech, which can be memorized as unanalyzed wholes. So when learners learn a new language, they copy and paste. This, in other words. So if they have all ready-made chunks, they would just use that ready-made chunks to convey or express what they want to say. And through that, they can learn how by using those ready-made chunks more often, they can learn how to use it more correctly. So this is likely to occur when the learner participates in routinized interactions involving the use of invariant utterances types by the native speaker. So Hash also said that, and Hash also referred to this type of input as canned speech. Canned speech is speech that is already packaged for you. So she suggests that adult learners may be able to control topics, as I mentioned before, to avoid the risk of the conversation taking off into fields the learner is not linguistically competent to handle, by the adroit use of formulae. In this way, they serve an immediate communicative purpose. Later on, the learner breaks them down into their constituent parts, and in doing so, augments his interlanguage system. Formulaic speech, therefore, contributes indirectly to the route of SLA by providing raw materials for the learner's internal mechanisms to work. So this, you can see more of it in Chapter 7. But in other words, to summarize this paragraph, is that for formulaic speech, it is a patternized way for learners to learn a second language. But for adults, it is much easier because they can control the use of this patternized speech and also control the topics in order to stop them from taking off, in this case, avoid the risk of the conversation taking off into fields the learner is not linguistically competent to handle. Okay, so 2. Vertical structures. Vertical structures are learner utterances which are constructed by borrowing chunks of speech from the preceding discourse. So as you can see here, the example from Ellis, when the teacher says, take a look at the next picture, and the student says, box. It's when we stop here, it's very obvious that the student only knows the word box. But when the teacher says, a box, yes. And then the student borrows the chunk from the previous sentence, a box, bananas. The student doesn't know how to use of, so he or she didn't use a box of bananas. Instead, they used a box bananas, which a box was borrowed from the previous sentence of the teacher. So it goes straight. The second language pupil's final utterance can be seen to consist of a repetition of the teacher's preceding utterance. For example, a box, plus an extra noun, bananas. It has been constructed vertically. Scollin has observed large numbers of similar constructions in first language acquisition. He points out that they are one of the principal means by which the child overcomes the constraints of the length of his utterances imposed by processing limitations. So, in here you can see that Scollin observed more of this in first language acquisition, in other words, how native speakers' children learn their first language. But similarly, this can also be used in SLA. As you can see later on, they may serve a similar purpose in SLA. Wagner-Go also found evidence of vertical structures in SLA. Her subject incorporated whole chunks of previous utterances into a speech. For example, come here. The learner says, no, come here. So in other words, when they learn a second language, they also borrow the previous chunks directly to what they want to say in how they express it. When they want to say, I won't come, the learner instead said, no, come here. Means, no, I don't want to come here. So she notes that sometimes a pattern was not immediately incorporated, but stored for later use. For example, it cropped up 2 or 3 turns later. So maybe sometimes when the learner borrowed the chunk, for example, come here, and then waited for 2 to 3 sentences after, then said, no, come here. It still means that there are vertical structures here, although they didn't directly use it after the sentence they borrowed. So later on, Long and Sato described a rather different use that learners make of the discourse context. They show how they rely on the interlocutor's previous utterance as a means of establishing time reference. In other words, a temporal reference is established by the interlocutor's utterance and assumed to carry over to the learner's utterance, even though the latter is not linguistically marked for time. Long and Sato referred to this use of context as another example of the general process of collaborative discourse. So, in other words, Long and Sato observed that there are other different uses for learners of using this vertical structure. They show that this can be also used for time references. Although that when the learners are using this vertical structure, there may be a chance that there are it is not linguistically marked for time. So on the second paragraph of page 156, collaborative discourse is the guise of vertical structures and context dependency.